September was always a fun month for video games. The holiday hype train was moving ahead full steam. It's as true then as it is now. So let's wind the clock back some 30-odd years and look at some of our old favorite video game magazines and just see how much and how little things have changed. We're going to start with this, the September 94 issue of Game Players magazine, and on the cover, we have a cover story for Killer Instinct, the arcade game. Made by Rare, published by Nintendo, and this was Nintendo's answer to the whole Mortal Kombat issue from a year earlier with their no blood in the SNES port. They're like, you want blood? We'll give you blood. Media got their first look at Killer Instinct at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. It debuted in arcades a month after this issue came out. CES was the show to go see new games and hardware in action at the time. This was before E3 came and, subsequently died. CES is still going on, still has some games today, but nowadays when we want updates on new games, we just get to watch a developer show on YouTube streamed directly to the consumer. One of the biggest games shown off at CES was Donkey Kong Country, which would come out later that year and blow everyone away who thought 16-bit was dead. I want to point out early in the issue some of these news bites and rumors. It's always fun to see the things that changed from the early chatter or just what never came to be. Here we have Street Fighter the movie. Just began filming with Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile and Raul Julia as M. Bison. As I'm sure you're aware, the film was a real flop in theaters, and the games based off of it, well, let's just say Capcom isn't too proud of them. I always preferred the anime movie, and I wonder if the new Street Fighter film that is being filmed with Cody Rhodes as Guile will be any better. Movies based off of video games were a bit more rare back then. Nowadays, they're just as regular as a Tuesday. And on the other side, we had a rumor about Sonic 4? This never had much to say, but it had me pretty excited as I was all in for the Sonic craze at the time. I'm not sure what game they're actually referring to here. Sonic 3D Blast had versions on Genesis, Game Gear, and Saturn, but I don't think that's what this is talking about. There was a game called Sonic 4 that was released in 2 episodes back in 2011. I downloaded the first one on the Wii. It was actually one of the first bigger games I downloaded onto a console. I think we all know what the real Sonic 4 was, and that was Sonic Mania. Also, we had news on Doom 2. I love that game. Even my dad loved the old Doom games, and all he ever played was Solitaire and Microsoft Flight Simulator. And here we have Slam City with Scottie Pippen. I really wanted to like this one, but, well, like most full-motion video games of the day, it just wasn't great. The big deal in this news bite section is the talk about the 3DO2, Panasonic's move to take a piece of the next generation pie. When asked what makes them think this could possibly compete with the PlayStation, N64, or Saturn, they said 3DO2 is backwards compatible with its previous gen. The new consoles weren't, and that's why we will win. This didn't end up helping them in the end, but backwards compatibility does end up being a big selling feature for new consoles these days. One more thing I want to point out, here it says Project Reality is given a name at last. They also mentioned actually that on this very page, it's Ultra 64, which isn't even the name the system ends up with. That would be Nintendo 64. Remember the Sega CDX? This was the first I saw of it. I thought it was so cool. I had a Genesis and Sega CD, so I felt a bit burned they made this thing when I already had my eye on the 32X and Saturn. Here I thought consumer burnout in 2025 was bad. I was feeling it back in '94 when I was only burning through my parents' money. Here's a look at a bunch of top 10 lists. No surprise, the magazine put Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Metroid at the top of their list. Notice how FIFA tops the UK list and the Japanese top 10 is a bunch of games I'd never heard of. What's a Gandam? World Tracks is the original name for Stunt Race FX, a game that in this very issue they said ran very poorly when they played it at CES. Final Fantasy VI would be released as Final Fantasy III in the West. Game Players also had a whole section dedicated to what games were big in Japan. This one gave me a laugh. STD has changed its name to Interact Game Products. This company actually made the first third-party controllers I ever got and is the reason I like the third-party stuff out today, like what 8BitDo does. Here's a gossip section that goes into some rumors, and wouldn't you know it, the first reference to the Virtual Boy, I think. The way it's described, a gun shooting a hologram on the floor, doesn't actually sound like the red headset that came out. There were also rumors printed in here about Atlas Games and Super Street Fighter 2 getting ported to the 32X that I'm afraid never saw the light of day. I just want to give a shout out to this awesome Final Fantasy III ad. They have a brief preview for it on a page with Phantasy Star 4. Here's the meat of why people bought this issue, a double-page spread review of Mortal Kombat 2. It got high reviews, a 95 on the SNES and a 92 on the Genesis. A few points off of the Sega's version purely for its lacking in graphics and music. But if you had either version of this, you couldn't go wrong. I also like the line, quote, "Nintendo let Acclaim keep the blood. I guess after Nintendo got their butts kicked last Christmas, they decided that a strong moral isn't really worth losing money over, after all." Could you imagine Nintendo letting morals get in the way of making money? This issue also had a color-coded moves list for the SNES, Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear versions of the game, which I really appreciated and added a lot of value to the magazine. Sure, nowadays you can just Google the moves or hit pause and check the options. Speaking of the portable versions of Mortal Kombat 2, they did not score very positive reviews. Compared to the 16-bit versions, I mean, why would you even get these? But if all you had was a Game Boy or Game Gear, I'm sure you'd appreciate it. I've never played either of these, but when Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection comes out next month, I'll definitely check these out, because I've always been morbidly curious. Lots of other great reviews in this issue for new games like R-Type, Starblade, and Blackthorn, but one of the coolest ones is this Game Boy version of Donkey Kong. It deserves that 93, and you should check it out. They made it take advantage of the Super Game Boy add-on to the Super Nintendo, too. Before we move on, I want to show you this letter that was published in the back of the issue from Lance Sneed of Newark, New Jersey. He basically says that there are too many games out right now and people should vote with their wallets. How do you feel about that suggestion in 2025? The editor replies that all games are just too similar now. One game formula works and everyone just copies it. Reading this makes me feel like the more things change, the more they stay the same. Now let's fast forward 1 year to September 1995, and what do we have on the cover here but Mortal Kombat 3. This is where the hype train started to die down a little bit. The live-action movie just came out that summer. Fans weren't so hot on the first version of Mortal Kombat 3, the one with the run button, but what really caught my eye with this issue was down here. We got ourselves a review for Chrono Trigger, made by the people behind, or some of the people behind, the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games. A lot of RPG fans will tell you this is their favorite RPG of all time. They give it a 95 in this issue and call it a must-have. They refined a lot of things that the team perfected on previous RPGs, like being able to avoid enemies, and battles occur in the regular background as opposed to a separate combat screen. For a lot of RPG fans, this still holds up as their favorite of all time. Now, just like a lot of you, I'm really sick of seeing ads everywhere these days, but when you look back on these old gaming magazines, we had some pretty good ones. Like right as soon as you open up, boom, Toshinden. Look at that cool ad. It doesn't stop there. We got one for Killer Instinct. When you fold it together, it says, "Kiss your butt goodbye." I'll take my word for it. And then what's next? We got Doom. Look at all those, look at that, all the ants. I love it. And then get to the masthead, and then, boom, after Chrono Trigger. And on the back, it's Batman Forever. Oh, the 90s. This issue starts with letters from readers, and a common theme I noticed back in the day were from people worried they couldn't afford the new systems if their current 16-bit consoles were going to be retired. The editors reply, "We need to evolve. Remember the NES or Master System? Of course you don't." What do you mean? Of course we do. It's funny how these days getting priced out of gaming is still a very valid concern, but the previous gen, and I'm talking PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch, they're still so popular it's a struggle to move on. Now there's talk of what's coming next, and we're sitting here asking when does the PS5 generation take off? By September 95, the battlefield was focused on Sega and the Saturn versus Sony and the PlayStation, which was released this month in North America, 30 years ago. I like this news bit about Team Sega playing Team Sony at a softball game and having drinks. Meanwhile, Nintendo skips the winter's CES. Sega managed to win that ball game. It was the only thing they'd ever win against Sony. A couple pages later, we have more details. When Sega dropped the Saturn early, 4 months earlier, the surprise left a lot of retailers unable to capitalize, which left them feeling burned and, in retrospect, may not have been the smartest move. But hey, all is fair in love and war, right? On the other hand, Sony sold the PlayStation to retailers for $329 US, which is about $700 today, accounting for inflation. They also gave them Ridge Racer to help offset the hardware losses when they sold it for $299 US. There's a neat tidbit in here. Word is that Sony is currently working on its, quote, ultimate gaming machine, end quote. That will incorporate DVD technology, a new standard compression technology that allows you to put movies onto a CD. This is 95, so they had to explain what a DVD was. Could this be an early reference to the PlayStation 2? Meanwhile, Sega had to fight back, so they repackaged the Saturn with Virtua Fighter Remix, an upscaled version of Virtua Fighter with some nicer coats of paint and a bit better graphics. They had to rush the first home version of Virtua Fighter to make that surprise launch window, and again, maybe not the best move. Another top 10 list. I like how they had the Reader's Top 10, which I think accurately reflects what gamers were into 30 years ago. Top of the stack is Final Fantasy III, but you also had Killer Instinct, Donkey Kong Country, NBA Jam, Mortal Kombat 2, Earthworm Jim. Game Players was always fixated on the latest, hottest thing. While the UK loved football, and cricket. They had cricket games? The top game in Japan at the time was a Parodius compilation, a game that parried Gradius in both name and style. Here we have a preview of Mortal Kombat 3, shaping up to be a big deal, especially for new PlayStation owners. Sony had an exclusivity deal for 6 months on the 32-bit version. It was positioned as the game to help people thinking about making the jump to 32-bit. You have to wait a bit more than 6 months for a version of this game to live up to the potential, though. Here's a preview for Maximum Surge, a full-motion video game by Digital Pictures starring Baywatch's Yasmin Bleeth that never came out. There was quite a bit coming to get excited for, and here's a page full of fun impending games. You had the sequel to Lunar, the 32X port of Virtua Fighter, which actually had a leg up on the Saturn version, Twisted Metal, which was a riot unlike anything we'd ever seen, and the Super NES port of Castlevania, Dracula X. One of the least hyped Mario games game players ever covered, Yoshi's Island, fully known as Super Mario World 2. The review is basically saying, yeah, this is cool, is there a Mario 64 coming or what? Also, here we have an ad for Earthbound. It was really hard to know what to make of this game at the time. If I had the internet instead of relying on gaming magazines, I'd probably have been more on the ball on this one. This is what really had my interest. Reviews of the first 5 Virtual Boy games. Everyone's talking about the Virtual Boy now because Nintendo is re-releasing it attached to their online subscription service next year. So here's what to expect. A lot of mediocrity. And a nice red port of the original Super Mario Bros. Game as Mario Clash. I'll forgo giving you my thoughts on the Virtual Boy. I'm old enough to remember seeing it in the bargain bins, and that's where I left it. What would you do with the new one when the servers go offline? Now let's look at what September 1996 had to offer, and it's Crash Bandicoot on the cover. He started out as Sony's answer to Mario and Sonic, but then he took a life of his own. It was this month, 29 years ago, when the Nintendo 64 would finally be released after a series of delays. By this point, both the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation had dropped in price to $199 US. Upwards of 3 times in sales that brought in. Retailers said they were neck and neck and it was looking like it could go either way for either system. How about this? Nintendo and Square have made up. This means they could start making N64 games anytime. Haha, if only. This one is hard to read. Graphic design was nuts back in the day, but X-Band, a lineup of modems for home consoles, was making its way to the Sega Saturn and offered the chance for Saturn players to play against PC players on some titles. The service was limited and was discontinued less than a year later. In this issue's gaming gossip section, there's a blurb that sounds like it could have been written today. A rumored PlayStation handheld is in development. The unit, should it come out in the US, looks like it will suffer a fairly hefty price tag, somewhere in the tune of $400. That's actually a bit over $800 US today. It would be about 8 years before the Sony PSP would come out, which was $249, and this was definitely not what they were talking about. This Bits and Bytes section mentions a Secret of Mana RPG for the Saturn, which, to my knowledge, never came out. But in 1999, there was a Legend of Mana for the PlayStation. There's also word here of Acclaim buying Psygnosis, which seems like it would have been a huge news at the time. Sony eventually bought the developer in 2012. In other news that never happened, talking about the N64 disk drive, a Legend of Zelda game called The Legend of Link, as well as a Kid Icarus and Metroid N64 games. I would have loved a Metroid on the N64. While none of this came to pass, they do have first rumblings here of Wave Race, which is a gold standard classic of the N64 library. Here we have another top 10 list, reflecting gamers' tastes at the time back in '96. Resident Evil really took the world by storm when it came out, but Chrono Trigger had people obsessed for ages after it had been released. Mario 64 was the big game for editors of this magazine. I think it was the one and only title they ever gave a perfect 10 score. I don't think they had even reviewed it yet by this point. This issue marked Game Player's third and final installment of their preview series for the new Saturn Sonic game, Sonic Extreme. This game had me super excited and happy to be a Saturn owner. Sadly, I would never actually get to play it because despite being this far along, it would never come out. Development complications, internal politics, and programmer illness all led to its demise. On the plus side, Red Shoe Diaries, that's just hilarious. Picking up the slack here is Crash Bandicoot, who is a big feature in this issue, which was on the stands right as the first game was released on PlayStation. I love the pencil sketches on this initial designs. It helped me get an instant feel and appreciation for the character. Now on to some reviews. Here is Tekken 2, one of my favorites. I love the Tekken series, and I think the graphic designer must have taken an early day to get this issue to the press by the deadline though. Here's one for Cosmic Race, probably the only game they ever gave a 0 rating for. It's also gotten very bad reviews across the board. Famitsu gave it a 16 out of 40, Next Generation gave it 1 star. I've never actually played it myself, but I've always been curious to see how bad it could really be. But not curious enough to actually buy it or anything. On the other hand, we've got a glowing review for Jumping Flash 2. The first one was a mind-blowing innovation, and though the second didn't really do anything much beyond the first, it still is just a great game. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Leave a thumbs up if you liked it, and I'll catch you on the next one.